In the spring of 1839, a committee of 5 men on horseback looked out over a stretch of Texas wilderness, 7,735 acres of cedar and live oak along the Colorado River, and agreed to buy it. The price was roughly $3 an acre. The total came to something in the neighborhood of $21,000. What they were purchasing, in theory, was a capital for a country that was 3 years old and might not survive the decade. Today, that land and the city that grew from it anchor a metropolitan economy valued at $268 billion. That makes it one of the fastest-growing regional economies in the history of the United States. And it happened in a place that, for 140 years, had almost no economic reason to exist at all. That is what makes Austin different from Houston, from Dallas, from San Antonio, from every other Texas city that boomed on cotton or cattle or oil or shipping. Austin boomed on nothing, or rather, on something so intangible that no one could have planned for it. The story of how a political backwater, a city that missed every great economic surge in Texas history, became the capital of American ambition in the 21st century. That story begins with a man on a buffalo hunt. Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar. And yes, that was his real name. The middle name, a gift from a father who admired Napoleon, was the second president of the Republic of Texas. He was a poet, a painter, and a dreamer of operatic scale. In 1838, while his predecessor Sam Houston was still president, Lamar went on a hunting expedition to the western frontier and found himself standing on a limestone bluff above the Colorado River, watching the light move across the hill country. He decided then and there that this was where the capital of Texas should be. Not Houston, the muddy, mosquito-plagued coastal city where the government currently sat. Not Nacogdoches or San Antonio. Here, on the edge of Comanche territory, 100 miles from the nearest settlement of any size. It was an act of magnificent stubbornness. When Lamar won the presidency in December 1838, he pushed a site selection commission to inspect the spot. They found a settlement called Waterloo, a name nobody could quite explain, consisting of 1 stockade, 4 families, and a man named Jacob Harrell, who lived in a tent on the riverbank. Lamar wanted the capital built there anyway. He named it Austin, after Stephen F. Austin, the founder of Anglo-American Texas, who had been dead since 1836 and had never set foot in the place. The man Lamar appointed to make it real was Edwin Waller, a Revolutionary veteran and future first mayor. Waller had less than 6 months to turn 7,000 acres of frontier into a functioning seat of government before Congress convened in November. He chose a 640-acre site between 2 creeks fronting the river and drew a grid, 14 blocks by 14 blocks, bisected by a broad avenue he named Congress. At the northern end of Congress Avenue, on the highest ground, he placed Capitol Square. At the southern end, the river. It was a simple plan, and it was a brilliant one. That axis, capital to river, power to water, the whole city organized along a single line of sight, still defines downtown Austin today. Walk out of the Capitol building, look south, and you see the same view Waller intended in 1839. Only now the foreground is full of glass towers. The first auction of lots took place on August 1st, 1839, under a stand of live oak trees. It raised $182,000, nearly 9 times what the land itself had cost. By October, the entire government of the Republic of Texas arrived from Houston by ox cart. By January, the population had swelled to 856 people. A Presbyterian church was organized. The Austin City Gazette began printing. France sent a diplomat, Alphonse Dubois de Saligny, who purchased 22 acres on a hill east of town and built a legation, the oldest surviving frame structure in Austin, and, it is worth mentioning, the site of a dispute with a local innkeeper over a herd of pigs that ate the Frenchman's linens and very nearly caused an international incident. But the city was fragile, more fragile than anyone building on Congress Avenue wanted to admit. Nearly half the population of 856 fled town whenever Congress recessed. When the weather turned or Comanche raiding parties pressed closer, more left. Lamar's political enemy, Sam Houston, won the presidency again in 1841 and immediately schemed to move the capital back to the coast. When Mexican troops briefly recaptured San Antonio in March 1842, Houston declared the frontier too dangerous and ordered the government archives, the land titles, the surveys, the legal records on which every property claim in the Republic depended, packed up and shipped to Houston for safekeeping. What followed is one of the stranger episodes in the history of American cities. The citizens of Austin refused. Without those archives, Austin had no reason to exist. Every resident understood this. On the night of December 30th, 1842, a company of men sent by Houston crept into town and began loading the documents into wagons. A boarding house keeper named Angelina Eberly spotted them, ran through the dark streets to the town cannon positioned on Congress Avenue, and fired it at the General Land Office. The blast missed the building but shattered the night. The town woke. A posse of armed residents chased the wagons north through freezing rain, caught them at Kenny Fort on Brushy Creek, and hauled the archives back to Austin at gunpoint. The episode became known as the Archive War, and it was not a metaphor. The people of Austin literally fought for their city's right to exist. The documents stayed, but the capital did not, at least not officially. The government decamped. The population fell to fewer than 200 people. For 3 years, Austin existed as a kind of ghost capital, a town whose only claim to significance was a stack of land records its residents had defended with a cannon and a midnight posse. The capital came back in 1845 by a vote of the full Congress. Texas was annexed by the United States the same year, and 2 statewide elections confirmed Austin as the permanent seat of government. But permanence brought no prosperity, not in the way that Houston's port or Galveston's harbor or later Dallas's railroads would bring it. Austin was a government town and not much else. The Houston and Texas Central Railway finally reached Austin in 1871, and a permanent bridge was built across the Colorado, connecting the city to outside commerce for the first time. The population, which had been 3,500 in 1860, doubled in the decade after the railroad arrived. By 1880, Austin had about 11,000 residents, enough to be a real city, though still a small one by Texas standards. The Civil War thinned it further. Travis County voters had opposed secession, but the Confederacy drafted their sons regardless. After the war, Austin rebuilt slowly, sustained by the 2 things that would define it for the next century: state government and, beginning in 1883, the University of Texas. The university's founding nearly didn't happen in Austin. When the Texas Constitution of 1876 mandated a university of the first class, other cities competed fiercely for it. Austin's successful campaign to host it was driven in part by a practical offer: 40 acres of land north of the capital set aside for the purpose as far back as 1839, and in part by a delicious irony. Opponents warned that locating a university near the state legislature would be a corrupting influence on young men. Austin's supporters argued that no, the proximity would enrich both. The students arrived in September 1883, 221 of them, meeting 8 professors in a building that wasn't finished yet. They had no way of knowing that this modest institution, built on land that Mirabeau Lamar's Congress had set aside before they were born, would eventually become the engine that powered everything. But that was still a century away. In the 1880s, Austin's ambitions were more tangible and more reckless. The decade brought 3 enormous projects, built almost simultaneously, that represented the city's grandest bet on itself. The first was a new state capitol. The old limestone building had burned in 1881, and Texas wanted a replacement worthy of the biggest state in the Union. The problem was money. Texas had none. What it had was land, 3 million acres of it in the Panhandle, flat and empty and unclaimed. In one of the largest barter transactions in recorded history, the state traded that land to a syndicate of Chicago investors led by Charles and John Farwell, who agreed to build the Capitol in exchange. The syndicate formed what became the XIT Ranch, 3 million acres stretching 200 miles along the New Mexico border, big enough to cover 10 counties. The architect was Elijah E. Myers of Detroit. The building material was sunset red granite, donated by the owners of Granite Mountain near Marble Falls after the original limestone plans were scrapped because the stone stained. Scottish stonecutters were imported when union workers protested the use of convict labor. The whole endeavor cost $3,744,000, not a dime of it in cash from the state treasury. When the Goddess of Liberty was hoisted to the top of the dome in February 1888, the building stood 308 feet tall, 14 feet higher than the national Capitol in Washington. 20,000 people came for the week-long dedication in May. The XIT Ranch that paid for all of it never turned a profit. The last of its cattle were sold in 1912. The second great project of the 1880s was the Driskill Hotel. Colonel Jesse Lincoln Driskill, a cattle baron who had made and lost a fortune supplying beef to the Confederacy, purchased a lot at the corner of 6th and Brazos for $7,500 in 1884 and announced he would build the finest hotel south of St. Louis. He spent $400,000, a staggering sum for a frontier town of 15,000, on a 4-story Romanesque building clad in 6 million pressed bricks, with a skylit dining room, a billiard hall, a barber shop, ladies' parlors, and 12 rooms with attached private baths, which was unheard of in Texas. The Driskill opened on December 20th, 1886, to a special edition of the Daily Statesman, hailing it as one of the finest hotels in the whole country. 2 weeks later, the new governor, Saul Ross, held his inaugural ball in its ballroom, beginning a tradition that every Texas governor has maintained since. 5 months after that, Driskill was forced to close. A drought and a record cold winter had killed 3,000 head of his cattle. He lost the hotel to his brother-in-law, some say in a poker game. He died 2 years later. The Driskill would change hands more than a dozen times over the next century, face demolition at least twice, and be rescued each time by citizens who could not bear to lose it. In 1934, a young congressional aide named Lyndon Baines Johnson took a woman named Claudia Taylor, Lady Bird, to breakfast in its dining room for their first date. 30 years later, he watched himself win the presidency from its 5th-floor suite. In 1969, the Driskill was threatened with demolition yet again when a proposed 19-story tower fell through, leaving the building shuttered. The Heritage Society of Austin mounted a public campaign. Citizens raised over $700,000. The hotel reopened in 1973 with a gala attended by over 1,000 guests, including every living Texas governor or their descendants going back to 1886. The Driskill is still there, still open, still on Congress Avenue, still the oldest operating hotel in Austin. A portrait of Colonel Driskill hangs in the lobby, gazing down at guests who pay more per night than he paid per acre for the land. It has outlasted every economic cycle the city has endured, which is saying something, because the third great project of the 1880s nearly destroyed Austin for good. The dam. In 1890, Austin city leaders, watching the oil boom transform other Texas cities, decided they needed an industrial revolution of their own. The plan was audacious. Build a massive granite dam across the Colorado River, harness the water power, and lure cotton mills to the riverbanks. Austin would become the Lowell of the South. A banker named George Brackenridge bought 500 acres downstream from the proposed dam site, anticipating a factory district. The citizens voted to put themselves deeply in debt through municipal bonds. After setbacks, cost overruns, and a string of engineers who quit in frustration, One compared the project management to fire and pestilence. The great granite dam was completed in 1893. It stood 60 feet high and stretched nearly 1,200 feet across the river. Behind it, Lake McDonald filled and became a fashionable recreation spot. Balloon ascensions, boat excursions, weekend picnics. The cotton mills never came. The Colorado's flow was too variable. The dam could barely generate enough power to run the city's streetcar line and its most distinctive civic amenity. 31 moonlight towers purchased in 1894 from the city of Detroit for the price of scrap. Each tower stood 165 feet tall, topped with 6 carbon arc lamps so bright you could read a watch face from 1,500 feet away. They were assembled in Austin in 1895, powered by the dam, and they turned night into something new. A man was hired at $2.50 a day to climb every tower every day to replace the carbon rods. Some citizens worried the constant light would make crops grow unnaturally fast. Others predicted police would become unnecessary. Neither happened. What did happen was that Austin, a town that couldn't attract a single factory, became the last city in the world to keep its moonlight towers standing. Every other American city that built them tore them down decades ago. Austin's are still there, 15 of them, flickering among the skyscrapers, casting the same glow they cast in 1895. On the morning of April 7th, 1900, after days of heavy rain, the Colorado River rose 11 feet above the crest of the dam. Just after 11 o'clock, the dam buckled, broke, and collapsed. The wall of water killed at least 50 people, destroyed the powerhouse, and left Austin without electricity for months. One man, quoted in the next day's paper, blamed the disaster on weekend leisure at the lake that had kept people out of church pews. The dam was penance for their sins, he said. But the real sin was hubris. A city of 15,000 people had gambled its future on becoming an industrial center, and the Colorado River had answered. Austin did not become an industrial center. It did not become anything, particularly for the next 60 years. Between 1880 and 1920, while Houston and Dallas and Fort Worth and San Antonio surged on oil and railroads and manufacturing, Austin slipped from the 4th largest city in Texas to the 10th. By 1905, it had few sanitary sewers, virtually no public parks, and a single paved street. Its economy rested entirely on 2 payrolls, the state government and the University of Texas. Government and education, people said, as though reciting a diagnosis. Austin was a pleasant place to live. It was a beautiful place to visit. But it was not a place where things happened. This reputation, sleepy, charming, irrelevant, persisted for so long that it became Austin's identity. The population grew, but modestly. 87,000 in 1940, 132,000 by 1950, 250,000 by 1970. During the Depression, the city fared better than most of Texas, cushioned by its twin payrolls. Mayor Tom Miller, a savvy political operator, secured more Federal Works Progress Administration funds per capita than almost any other city in the South. The projects transformed Austin. New parks, new roads, Barton Springs Pool, the crown jewel of Austin's public recreational life, and, most consequentially, a series of dams built upstream by the new Lower Colorado River Authority. The Highland Lake system tamed the Colorado River that had destroyed Austin's Great Dam in 1900, ending the floods that had plagued the city for decades and creating the reservoirs, Lake Travis, Lake Austin, that would later become some of the most desirable waterfront real estate in Texas. Lyndon Johnson, who had met Lady Bird at the Driskill in 1934, made Austin his political base. He ran his campaigns from the hotel, watched election returns from its suites, and when he was in the White House, the Driskill served as the press headquarters whenever the president came home to Texas. But Johnson's power was Washington power, not Austin power. It brought journalists and Secret Service agents, not factories or corporate offices. The oil booms passed Austin by entirely. Other Texas cities had refineries, shipping terminals, defense plants, petrochemical complexes. Austin had the Capitol, the university, and a swimming hole fed by underground springs. What no one understood, what took until the late 20th century to become visible, was that this absence was not a failure. It was an inheritance. In 1957, a group of Austin business leaders looked at the city's economic situation and made a decision that, in retrospect, changed everything. They were not visionaries in the usual sense. They were pragmatists who could see that Austin needed private sector jobs to survive. They formed the Austin Area Economic Development Foundation and began recruiting companies, but not the heavy manufacturers that Houston and Dallas were chasing. They targeted electronics and scientific equipment firms. The reasoning was partly practical. Austin had no deep-water port, no oil fields, no heavy rail infrastructure. What it did have was a major research university, a low cost of living, no state income tax, and a quality of life that made it easy to persuade engineers to move. The foundation, in essence, decided to sell Austin not as a place to build things, but as a place to think. The first to arrive was Tracor, a defense electronics firm founded in 1955 by a group of University of Texas researchers who specialized in acoustics and underwater sound for the Navy. It would become Austin's first publicly traded company and eventually land on the Fortune 500. Tracor was valuable, but it was also a creature of government contracts, money that could vanish with a budget cut. The real validation came from the private sector. In 1967, IBM opened a manufacturing plant to build Selectric typewriters with 400 employees in North Austin. The typewriter factory was not, on its face, a transformative event. But IBM was IBM. Its presence signaled that a serious company had looked at Austin and found it worthy. Texas Instruments followed in 1969. Motorola arrived in 1974, opening a semiconductor plant that would eventually employ 11,000 people. The University of Texas launched the IC2 Institute in 1977 to bridge the gap between academic research and commercial technology. Then, in 1982, the event that cracked Austin's history in two. A consortium of American computer and semiconductor companies, desperate to counter Japan's dominance in electronics, formed the Microelectronics and Computer Technology Corporation, MCC. It was the first for-profit research consortium of its kind in the United States, led by Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, the former director of the National Security Agency. 57 cities submitted bids to host it. The competition was ferocious. Atlanta's mayor, Andrew Young, led a high-powered pitch. Research Triangle, Stanford, George Mason, all competed. Austin's bid was orchestrated like a military campaign. Ross Perot lent his private jet to fly MCC officials around the state. The University of Texas Board of Regents offered 20 acres in North Austin and pledged to construct a $22 million building. MCC would pay $1 a year in rent. Local banks floated subsidized mortgage loans for MCC employees. Texas A&M and UT committed to tripling the size of their microelectronics research programs. When MCC officials toured the UT Performing Arts Center, a concert pianist was on hand to play for them. When Admiral Inman wanted a private tour of the city, the head of the Chamber of Commerce Industrial Recruitment Program, John Gray, drove him around in a beat-up Buick. No limousine, just a local guy showing off his hometown with unscripted enthusiasm. Austin won. The announcement came in May 1983. Andrew Young's response was blunt. "I gather Texas bought it." He was not entirely wrong. The state's total incentive package exceeded $49 million. But the transparent evaluation process, released after the announcement, showed Austin leading the field in quality of life issues. The city had sold something it didn't fully realize it possessed. 1 year later, in the fall of 1984, a 19-year-old pre-med student at the University of Texas named Michael Dell was upgrading IBM personal computers in room 2713 of Dobie Hall, a private dormitory near campus. He'd noticed that IBM PCs sold in retail stores carried enormous markups and limited customization. He began buying surplus machines at cost, adding memory and disk drives, and selling them directly to customers out of his dorm room, advertising in local papers. By January 1984, he was doing $30,000 a month in sales. His parents, an orthodontist and a stockbroker in Houston, hoped he would finish his pre-med degree. When they paid him a surprise visit, he hid his computer inventory in a friend's room. By May, he incorporated Dell Computer Corporation with $1,000 in capital and dropped out of school. Dell's company did not invent new technology. What it did was invent a new way of selling technology, direct to the customer, built to order, no middleman. By the end of 1989, annual sales were $258 million. By 1999, Dell was the largest PC vendor in the United States. The company's headquarters settled in Round Rock, just north of Austin, and its presence created a gravitational pull that drew suppliers, engineers, venture capitalists, and competitors to the region. Michael Dell became a billionaire before he turned 30. He never finished his degree. There was one more domino. In 1988, 5 years after MCC, another federal consortium chose Austin. Sematech, a public-private partnership of 14 semiconductor manufacturers funded in part by the Department of Defense, aimed at reclaiming American leadership in chip fabrication. Its presence deepened Austin's semiconductor infrastructure and sent a signal to every chip company in the world that Central Texas was where the action was. MCC itself would eventually fizzle. Its member companies struggled to share research with competitors, and in 2000, its remaining employees held a wake at Scholz's Beer Garden, Austin's oldest beer garden. But the ecosystem it seeded had already outgrown it. These three threads, MCC's legitimization of Austin as a technology center, Dell's proof that a world-changing company could be built here, and the steady accumulation of semiconductor and defense firms since the 1960s, braided together in the 1990s to produce what locals started calling Silicon Hills. Samsung opened its Austin fabrication plant in the late 1990s. AMD established major operations. Applied Materials, Tokyo Electron, and ARM Holdings followed. The nickname was self-conscious, a deliberate echo of Silicon Valley, but it pointed to something real. Austin's hills, the limestone terrain of the Balcones escarpment that had made the city too rugged for heavy industry, were filling up with clean rooms and chip fabs. Meanwhile, a parallel story was unfolding on 6th Street and South Congress and in the honky-tonks of East Austin, one that had nothing to do with semiconductors and everything to do with the kind of city Austin was becoming. In 1972, Willie Nelson left Nashville and came home to Texas, settling in Austin, where he found a city that didn't care whether he wore a cowboy hat or grew his hair to his shoulders. The Armadillo World Headquarters, a converted National Guard armory on Barton Springs Road, became the crucible of a new sound, cosmic cowboy, progressive country, a fusion of rock and honky-tonk that attracted hippies and rednecks to the same dance floor. The Armadillo had no air conditioning. It had a beer garden with a pet armadillo. It had a capacity of 1,500, and it was packed nearly every night from 1970 to 1980, hosting everyone from Bruce Springsteen to Ray Charles to Commander Cody and his Lost Planet Airmen. Stevie Ray Vaughan played the blues clubs on 6th Street before he was old enough to drink in them. Asleep at the Wheel brought Western swing back from the dead. Antone's, opened in 1975 by Clifford Antone, became the home of the blues in Texas, booking Muddy Waters and James Cotton alongside local acts who could hold the stage with anyone. Austin City Limits, the PBS television show, began taping at the University of Texas in 1976 and became the longest-running music program in American television history. By the 1980s, Austin was calling itself the live music capital of the world, a slogan that was equal parts boast and self-fulfilling prophecy. Call yourself the music capital long enough, and musicians show up to test the claim. What mattered in the long run was not just the music, but what the music said about the city's character. Austin was informal. It valued originality over pedigree. It mixed genres and classes and didn't much care about credentials. These were cultural traits, not economic ones, but they turned out to be exactly the traits that the technology economy prized. In 1987, 4 staff members from the Austin Chronicle, Louis Black, Nick Barbaro, Roland Swenson, and Louis Myers, organized a music industry conference inspired by the New Music Seminar in New York. They expected 150 people. Over 700 showed up on the first day. They called it South by Southwest, a nod to the Hitchcock film North by Northwest. Within 7 years, SXSW had added film and interactive media components. Within 20, it was the most important technology and culture festival in the world, the place where Twitter launched, where unknown bands became famous overnight, where Barack Obama ate tacos and gave a keynote on civic engagement. By 2026, it generated more than $377 million in economic impact for a city that, within living memory, had struggled to pave its streets. And then came the Great Migration. In December 2020, Oracle announced it was moving its corporate headquarters from Redwood City, California, to Austin. The same month, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise moved to Houston, and Charles Schwab relocated to Dallas. But it was Oracle's move to Austin that carried the symbolic weight. Larry Ellison, one of the richest men on earth, choosing a city that 60 years earlier had been the 10th largest in its own state. Tesla followed. In July 2020, Elon Musk selected a 2,500-acre site near Austin-Bergstrom International Airport for Gigafactory, Texas. He moved Tesla's corporate headquarters from Palo Alto in December 2021. By early 2024, the factory employed nearly 23,000 workers, making it Austin's largest private employer. Total investment exceeded $5 billion. Apple, which had been in Austin since 1992, announced a billion-dollar campus expansion in North Austin. Samsung committed $17 billion to a semiconductor plant in Taylor, 20 miles northeast, one of the largest capital investments in the history of Central Texas. Between 2018 and 2024, Austin attracted 81 corporate headquarters relocations, second only to Dallas-Fort Worth in raw volume, first in the nation per capita. In 2020 alone, 154 companies announced moves to Austin. Venture capital poured in, nearly $8 billion in 2025, the city's best year ever. The metro area's GDP, which had been $119 billion as recently as 2015, reached $268 billion by 2024. Real GDP growth over the 5 years ending in 2024 was 36%, the highest of any major metro area in America. The numbers are extraordinary, but they are also, in a sense, the least interesting part of the story. What is interesting is why. Why Austin? Why not Houston, which has a deepwater port and the world's largest medical center? Why not Dallas, which has more Fortune 500 headquarters? Why not San Antonio, which has the military installations and the lower costs? The answer, when you strip away the press releases and the Chamber of Commerce slogans, goes back to a choice that was made by default over 140 years, the choice not to industrialize. Austin never got the oil boom. It never got the refineries, the stockyards, the shipping terminals, the heavy rail yards. What it got instead was a university, a state government, 7 hills above a river, springs that run clear year-round, live oak trees older than the Republic, and, by the mid-20th century, a critical mass of people who had moved there because they liked the way it felt to live there. When the technology economy arrived, demanding a workforce that chose employers rather than the other way around, Austin discovered that everything it had been mocked for, its lack of industry, its laid-back culture, its stubborn prettiness, was exactly what the new economy wanted. Engineers who could work anywhere chose to work where the music was good, the food was cheap, the weather was warm, and the state didn't tax their income. Austin hadn't planned this. It had backed into the future. There are costs to this transformation, and they are not hidden. The median home price in the Austin metro, which was under $200,000 in 2012, surpassed $500,000 by 2022. The skyline that was once defined by the Capitol Dome and the University of Texas Tower now bristles with 55 buildings over 200 feet tall, with the Independent standing 694 feet, dwarfing the Capitol that once commanded the view from every angle. The music venues that built the city's reputation are being priced out by the technology economy that feeds on that reputation. The Armadillo World Headquarters was demolished in 1981 to build an office tower. Liberty Lunch closed in 1999. The affordable rents that let unknown musicians survive between gigs have largely vanished. Every year, the city debates whether it is still the live music capital of the world or merely a place that once was. And the companies that arrived with such fanfare have proven more restless than anyone expected. Oracle, 4 years after moving its headquarters to Austin, announced in 2024 that it would relocate again, this time to Nashville. Tesla cut 2,700 Austin jobs in a 2024 round of layoffs. Meta pulled some of its Austin operations back to California. The pandemic-era stampede of 154 relocations in a single year slowed to 11 by mid-2024. The boom cooled. The cranes thinned out. The for lease signs appeared on buildings that had been fully occupied 2 years earlier. But Austin has been here before. It has been left for dead more often than any major American city. Its population fell to 200 people in the 1840s. Its Grand Dam collapsed in 1900. Its first great hotel went bankrupt within 5 months. The oil wealth that built every other Texas city passed Austin by as if it didn't exist. Each time, the city survived on the same 2 foundations, government and education. And each time, something unexpected grew from the gap. The 15 surviving Moonlight towers still stand in Austin's old neighborhoods, the only ones left in the world. They are 131 years old. They no longer illuminate anything that needs illuminating. They are surrounded now by LED streetlights and high-rise apartment buildings with floor-to-ceiling windows. In 1993, the city spent $1.3 million to restore every bolt, turnbuckle, and guy wire. In 2024, the last of them was fitted with 80-watt LED bulbs to replace the incandescent ones that had replaced the mercury vapor ones, that had replaced the carbon arc ones, that a man earning $2.50 a day used to climb up and change by hand. Every December, the Moonlight Tower in Zilker Park is wrapped in lights and used as the trunk of Austin's municipal Christmas tree. Families drive from across the city to stand beneath it and look up through the spiraling strands at the same structure that in 1895 was supposed to herald Austin's transformation into an industrial powerhouse. The factories never came, the dam broke, the plan failed completely. And in the space that failure left, in the pleasant, unambitious, stubbornly beautiful city that resulted, the 21st century walked in and made itself at home. On Congress Avenue, if you stand at the right angle, you can still see what Edwin Waller intended in 1839. The Capitol on its hill at one end, the river at the other, and between them the whole improbable length of a city that a poet president conjured from the wilderness for $21,000.